Great. Did great. Finished with engines last time.
And thanks again for doing this, Captain. I appreciate this
Sure.
this visit. This episode begins actually with that final video of you shutting down the engines on the American Queen one last time.
Right.
This episode will not be on ACL, nothing like that. I want to know memories and good stories about the friend that was the American Queen to you for however many years we'll get into. But let's begin where all these usually start. When were you born? Where were you born? What was the situation at home? What was your parents do for a living? Any siblings? What sort of steered you on your path to the career you chose?
I was born in 1960, May of 1960. I made 64 this last month. And my parents were very, very close with me as far as doing all types of activities, particularly on the weekends when they were off. My dad worked for the New Orleans Public Belt Railroad, which is still in existence. They handle all the shifting and all the trains around the riverfront and Huey Long Bridge. He was on the train that originally went across the Huey Long Bridge for the first time. My mother worked for the federal government for years. She worked at the port of embarkation, which was at Poland Street, and they were in charge of loading all the military ships during all the conflicts and wars. And then later, she worked exclusively loading the Cristobal, which was a ship that ran in the Panama Canal Zone. And she eventually climbed her way up with the government. She was the chief administrator for supplies at the Veterans Administration Hospital. And it all started where they would take me to the parks every weekend, and the first venture on the water was to ride the president because my parents were avid ballroom dancers, and they always made the president every Friday and Saturday night. It was a popular thing. It had this huge dance floor. It had some of the finest bands at the time that were swing bands, and they bought me on the president as real young. I vaguely remember this, but I was sort of terrified when I stepped on the boat. And when the boat let all the lines go and they had the departure whistle, it just scared the living hell out of me. And I was miserable the whole trip, crying. And then they brought me back. And then as I was a kid, I got to thinking about it more. And I said, wow, that was pretty interesting, even though it just scared me to death. So I started reading books about steamboats, and I became very interested in it. I found that there was people who collected photographs, and I followed all the leads what the books had as far as the pictures and people who supplied the photographs and where all the steamboat libraries were. So I really got into it. So I told them, I said, I want to go back on the boat. And they were like, nah, that wasn't too good. So eventually it worked, and we kept on going every so many weekends. And uh, I had read about one of the pilots on the president, T. Joe Decker, who was actually a pilot on the Sprague. And he worked the Sprague when she ran for Esso or Standard Oil. And I ran across his picture in one of the books, and I kind of studied everything around. And one day I was just walking in front of the pilot house for departure, and he was testing the gear, he was testing the steering, and testing the telegraphs. And I took my chances. I kind of stood on the chair. I walked up in front of the pilot house window, which was open. And I said, Captain T. Joe. Oh, yeah. How do you know me? I said, well, I'm interested in boats, and I read that. Oh, come right on in the pilot house, which is usually a response to all these guys. So I met him, and he talked a lot about the boats, and he said, well, we're getting ready to go. He said, Captain Verne will be up here shortly to take the boat out. And I knew back then he was in his 80s. I think he worked the boat till he was 90. So I said, well, let me step out then. Oh, no, you can stay. I want you to meet him. I'm like, wow, it's pretty heavy. I'm going to meet one of the original Streckfus sons who started the Streckfus line in the teens in the 1900s. And So I met him, and that went very well, and they became really close. And eventually, Captain Tijo was the guy who was actually watching me during grade school when my parents weren't home. I'd actually go. His wife would pick me up, and we'd go to his house, and he'd kind of like babysit. So I told him from the start. I said, I wanted to be a pilot, and he said, well, you're a little young. He said, what are you going to make? I said, well, I'm getting ready to make 10 years old, but I'm kind of interested in this stuff. I like driving the boats and seeing how everything works. So he shared all this knowledge with me, and from then on, I got a job. It was only like a couple of weekends. That was taking tickets on the boat. This was back in '69, late in early '70, and you would just stand there, and people would buy tickets from a booth that was located in the center of the main deck, and walk over to a gate, and you'd tear the ticket and give them half back, and that was sort of like my first job. But eventually, I got to working as a deckhand, and the Natchez came out in 1975, and I really wanted to work on that boat because the president was a steam side wheeler at the time, and the Natchez was a stern wheeler. And I thought, well, this would be pretty cool. And I talked it over with Captain T. Joe. He says, well, it's going to be competition, but he says, I'll tell you the truth. He said, all of these captains like Captain Verne and Captain Curran that was on at the time, they all respect everybody. It was Doc Hawley and Roddy Hammett that was on the Natchez at the time. So my parents and I started riding over there. And I noticed something that was really cool. I mean, in order to hear the bridge commands on the president, which went from the bridge to the pilot house and docking instructions and everything, the Natchez came out with a system where they had a megaphone, and they used a PA system to broadcast it back to the captain who gave the pilot the orders of docking. So I said, this is really cool. I can listen to everything that's going on here, and I don't even have to be on the boat. So I started sneaking down to the docks and watched them dock all the time. And when they started out, it was a horrific river season. It was 1975. The water was really high, and Toulouse Street, where they docked, was noted for just this horrible eddy. Sometimes it would be running downstream 6, 7 miles an hour. A ship would go by and something would affect it, and the water would turn. So with this boat, they would get in all kinds of precarious situations coming in and out of the dock. To kind of compare what was going on at the time, that particular dock was offered to the Strex's family because they were there first. And Captain Burns said, no, you can't operate an excursion boat from there because the eddy's too bad. And when ships come around Algiers Point, if they lose steering, they're going to hit you. Well, all of that has happened. The Natchez has been hit numerous times. I was actually on the Mississippi Queen one time where the Natchez and us got hit by a ship that didn't make Algiers Point. So the long and the short was I was able to get a job on the Natchez, but it wasn't quite what I wanted to start with. I wanted to get on the deck crew. But what happened is that Captain Hawley had came from the Belle of Louisville, and he kind of brought all the guys from Louisville down to the boat with him. So he had his own deck crew. And I talked to him all. He said, well, it might be a way. He said, well, we can get you on in the dining room. Well, the dining room job that I took at that time turned out to be a restaurant attendant, which was okay. I was still working on the Natchez, and it was a steam stern wheel. Oh, it was great. So they said they were going to promote me to the dining room. And we had been to restaurants a whole lot. So I knew a little bit about serving food, but not really that much. But I quickly found out that all of the ladies that I was working with were pretty money hungry for tips. So I would give them my tables and go up to the pilot house and steer the boat because I got to know Captain Sam and Captain Manson, who were the pilots there. And that worked out pretty well until one day somebody came up and took a picture, and I was steering the boat in a waiter's vest. I think the management looked at that and said, wow, what is a waiter doing on the stick? So that kind of screwed that up. But at that time, I got on the deck crew, so everything was okay. And I started talking to everybody about their experience, just like you interview people. And I was always fascinated with the towboats. I wanted to go onto the towboats. But what I first did was I got my operator's license, a 100-ton operator's license back in 1978. And it was what we would refer to now sort of like as a crew boat license. But there was no openings at the Natchez. But Streckfus, who I had worked with before and knew all the people, had what we call these T-boats, which is the Mark Twain and the Commodore. And they were 100-ton boats. It's the same Mark Twain that operates right now in Hannibal, Missouri. So that was the first boat that I was captain on. And it was really great experience because we would run the intracoastal. We would leave Canal Street, go down river, go into the Algiers locks, and go all the way back to Jones Point, where the old Indian cemetery was, and turn around and then come back and come out through Harvey. So you made 2 locks. You had all the canal stuff. You had all the tight areas. The Harvey Canal back in those days was like unbelievable. They were building all the rigs that are in the Gulf right now. And you had these barges that would come out and get sideways and load lifts. And you had to skinny your way past them. Sometimes you'd have to hold up. The locking procedures were pretty tough because you had priority lockings at 11:15 and at 2:15 at Harvey, 11:15 at Algiers. So you had to do everything you could to make that schedule, plus still make the tour. And it was really good experience.
Where is I think you said Jones Point was where you turned?
Yeah, that's mile 15.
15. Okay. Thank you.
Right. It's a triangle. Right now, they have a whole lot of swamp tours from there. And ironically, the swamp tour boats that are there is what actually put the larger boats out of business. Because rather than rotting a boat for hours and hours just to see the bayous, swamps, and marshes, you now can take a bus and get right on a swamp boat and you go feed alligators, and that's the thing that people wanted to see anyway. So it pretty much put them out when they started that close-up bayou stuff. And that's how those boats got put out.
All right, I cut you off a little bit. Please continue the story.
Okay, so anyway, I started that for a while, and then I decided that I wanted to be on the towboats. So the guys on the Natchez got me to make a couple of trips on the old Clark Berry, which was a canal barge line at the time. They were pushing a 1,100-foot sulfur tow. I thought that was interesting. So I went back and got a lot of steering time over there. Eventually, I went on the deck with EMARD. So I was building time to get my towing license. At the time, they called that an operator of uninspected towing vessels. So at the same time, I was able to secure that license after doing all that time on the towboats. I was also able to secure what they call a second-class pilot license. And the pilot licenses, for those that aren't familiar, is that you take a test and then you also actually draw the entire river for the sections of miles that you're sitting in. The first one that I did was mile 88 to Algiers Canal, the 106 Huey Long Bridge, and I drew that, successful at doing that. A lot of people would say, well, why are you wasting your time doing that? Well, here was the trick to it at the time. That enabled you to sail on a first-class pilot license. So when I turned 21, I was able to sit for the any gross ton master because I had accumulated that time on any gross ton boats. And that's what really got me into the thick of the passenger boats. I didn't know it at the time, but I really should have realized because of history and the way things go. You really have to keep a close contact with the towboats if you're on these passenger boats. Eventually, even the Streckfus line, when I was still with them, failed. They went out of business. They sold to New Orleans Steamboat Company. They got the president, the Commodore, Mark Twain. And eventually, they really didn't hold on to them. They sold to a St. Louis outfit. So where I'm going with this is that every time you have these really good jobs, and they were great jobs at the time, you always had to be ready to be let go because the companies failed, just like the American Queen. And all the time to have that ability to go back on the towboats and having learned all these routes was a big plus to me. When Captain T. was babysitting me, he made me memorize a 1938 light list, which I still have, and that helped with drawing all this stuff and getting the first class pilots. You know, We went over the whole river from New Orleans to St. Paul and did some on the Ohio River, just in the book. And he would talk to me. He was talking to me about the old locks. And then after I made a few trips on the Ohio River, I realized that a lot of what he was talking about wasn't even there anymore. He had given me this old thing with all the old lock numbers. Last ones, of course, to go was 52 and 53. But he knew all the approaches from all the locks all the way to Pittsburgh, all 53 of them. So I thought that was pretty impressive. But
before we go too much further into your personal story, I made a note to ask, and while you're speaking about Captain Tijo right now, I figured I'd go ahead and interject. You said he operated the Sprague for Esso and Standard Oil. What do you know of his career? Can you tell me about any stories he may have shared of those days?
he worked for Standard Oil for a long time. He was on the Jack Rathbone, Alexander Mackenzie, all the old stern wheel, the big stern wheel towboats. He started on a smaller tug in Baton Rouge. He was from Northern Louisiana, and he sort of did what I did. He got to know all the pilots and kind of made friends with them and kind of worked his way up into the heavy tows.
What was it like? I guess stories he may have shared of the old days on those paddle wheelers.
Incredible. I mean, there's a lot of pilots and there's a lot of captains that I work with now that are really strict, but incredibly strict. I mean, if you got out of shape for something and you were 10 feet off, it was bad news. I mean, you got to watch this, and you can't be looking this way and this way. You got to see all around. You see that stern setting in there, really, really meticulous on how they did stuff, even more so today. It would be really interesting to see how he would operate and what he would think of things like Rose Point. I mean, that would be fascinating to me now.
Sorry, thank you for that. Again, I'll interject as I need to, but please continue your
Oh
story.
no,
Thank you, sir.
ask away because I prefer to take your lead on the questions.
Well, please carry forward with your, tell me about your first time getting on towboats and how different that was an experience.
That was very different. You had so much more weight to control than you did, on the passenger boats. Passenger boats were big and light, but one thing about the towboats that I loved, you could actually see where you were going. When you were on the larger boats, even the American Queen, you can't see anything. You go over to the wing station when you have to do tight maneuverings, docking, or anything. But to be behind barges and just to actually watch things, and it really helped me see what was going on as the tow was sliding, swinging, and everything else, and plus what everybody had drilled in my head. Um, I'm a little bit different. I was talking to a really good friend of mine not too long ago, and we were talking about the demise of the American Queen. We knew it was going to happen. And he was one of the pilots with me on the Mississippi Queen. He said, I really hate to see all of this licensing stuff, this unlimited masters and the first class pilot, just go to waste on a towboat. And I wanted to say something there, but we're good friends, and he was my boss at one of the towing companies that I work with. I don't want to get on the bad side. But I thought to myself, I admire the people pushing all the weight. I mean, yeah, it's good to be on the passenger boat and people see you, talk to people, you do a lot of things, but it requires so much more skill. I mean, to me, the towing license is the thing that's superior as far as what you're doing in piloting, as far as, the passenger vessels. I always felt just the opposite.
Well, keep walking through your career. I think there's a few more stops along the way.
Oh, yeah. Well, I left off, I guess, on the okay, so when I got to be 22, I think there was an 82. I was set for my any gross ton master license, and I continued to draw the river. That unfortunately turned out to be sort of a sad story because I drew from the head of the passes, right at Pilottown, up to Baton Rouge, and I want to say it was probably something like 8 or 9 segments. Also did a lot of parts on the Intracoastal, which I still have. And my whole objective was to be like some of the older guys that I work with, to have license on the Upper Miss, the Ohio, the Cumberland, the Tennessee. And I had all that down. I was doing it. We actually started, there was 4 or 5 of us that had started drawing these routes. And 2 of the guys got through everything and wound up by getting the entire river on their license, just about. But while we were in the process of doing our tests, the Delta Queen Steamboat Company, who operated the Delta Queen and the Mississippi Queen at the time, went to the Coast Guard and decided that they would find a way to discontinue the pilotage between the Upper Baton Rouge Bridge and everything north of there. And it was a very bitter thing amongst the older pilots that I grew up with. I was working with Captain Bobby Powell at the time, who actually recently passed, and he became just livid about it. He said, "Well, this is wrong. We're decreasing, the safety and everything. Now all you need is a master." And later on, it was a mate's license to stand a pilot watch above the Upper Baton Rouge Bridge on those 2 particular vessels. But the company was having a lot of hard times in finding people who actually had the licenses, and they really didn't have a lot of people that were coming up from deck who wanted to do it. So during the process of us drawing, I think it was 4 or 5 guys that was in the room at the time that was actually discontinued, and we didn't actually continue our first class pilot licenses there. Everything that we had drew that was in every other port that was like a seaport or where ships travel, where they still had pilotage in effect, that was given. But everything above the Upper Baton Rouge Bridge on the Mississippi River or any of the rivers was taken out and no longer continued. But one of the times that I got on the Delta Queen as a pilot was the fact that they were running down to Fort Jackson, and they were actually having to use Crescent pilots and federal pilots to bring the boat down there because they didn't have anyone who had that particular license. So I picked up on that right away. I always used to carry a radio with me, and I would listen to everything. And I would hear a Crescent pilot departing on the Delta Queen. So I went up to the management and I said, "Listen, I see you using the pilots to do this. And, I have the license for doing that. I mean, oh, great. So that's it. I started on there, and I was with all the guys who I kind of grew up with. It was even better. So that lasted until another bankruptcy occurred with Delta Queen, Mississippi Queen. There was about maybe a 2-year layup there. I recall one year there was probably like about a 4-year layup due to bankruptcies. So all that while, what happens there is that you go on the towboats. I was lucky to also work on the Creole Queen as captain. I was doing relief piloting on the Natchez sometimes whenever they needed somebody. So I always maintained the passenger boat thing and the towboat thing going at the same time. And that's really the only way that you made it if you were going to do passenger boats, because they all come to an end.
Well, fill me in on your towboat career. Did you eventually become a ship pilot as well?
Oh, no.
No?
I ran for the ship pilots a total of 19 times. I'm 64, so back when I was in the limits of actually getting in, which would say between the ages of 25 and 40, there were no outsiders. The only person that I ever knew that cracked it was Captain Ted, who you just interviewed. And at the time Captain Ted got in the pilots, I was still a deckhand. It always gave me some hopes. So I got to know a lot of the Noble Crescent pilots and the bar pilots. I rode with them all to make trips. And I really thought that I had a chance, but at that time, it just really wasn't opened up to outsiders at all. I mean, there may have been some special circumstances. I mean, Captain Ted used to bring them on the Delta Queen all the time. I met quite a few of them there making trips. But for outsiders, I mean, that was just like a no-go thing. So later on, I would say I ran for the state pilots around 15 or 16 times. I also tried to get into the federal pilots and put in an application there. The first election came and I didn't get in, and I was like, wow, this is kind of strange. I already have the license, and everything else. And at the time, they were pretty fiercely competitive, and there was a lot of bitterness between them and the state pilots. So the president of the association eventually told me, he said, listen, he said, you know, too many state pilots. We can't do this. You know, they just not comfortable with you coming into the organization, knowing all these people. You know, we're afraid we're about sharing rates, and you know, I'm like, oh my god, here we go again. So that's okay. You know, there was always some other job to go to. COVID was another thing that affected the boats, and I'll get into this first before we get into the situation with the American Countess and Duchess and the Queen of that particular company. Uh, COVID basically, of course, shut everything down at that point. You know, that was another layup. So I went to work for Southern Towing at the time. I worked for Magnolia, where I work now as well, but Southern was the most steady job. I was on the Baxter Southern for just about all of those seasons that those boats were shut down for that. And eventually they managed to come back. I believe they even picked the American Duchess, which was the boat that had the least capacity because there were COVID rules. You know, a boat could only handle so many people, so it was cheaper for them to put the boat that had the lower capacity in. So we started on that, and then we progressed. But I should go into it. I jumped ahead a little bit. The American Countess was being built as the third boat, and it sat for almost 2 years. Business was, at least they thought, was so good at that point that they wanted three boats. The Countess was a boat called the Canesville Queen, and they actually bought it. I actually bought the boat there. They bought it to a shipyard, cut it in half, and put a plug in the middle so it could carry more passengers. So their idea was to have these three high capacity boats, but the American Countess ran around these harbors for 2 years back and forth to the shipyard and layup before it even carried one passenger. And I'm sure that hurt a lot. Eventually they came out, but by the time we took on passengers in New Orleans on our first trip, the boat was almost 2 years old. And that probably hurt pretty bad. It's interesting. All the boats were actually running on the same route a lot of times. I don't never did really quite figure that out, but the company thought that the American Queen was sold out all the time, and it really was. We were carrying like 400 people a trip, and it was really rolling into money before COVID hit. And they thought that they could bring on these other vessels and sell. They built the Duchess as a really larger boat that carried few people, and they wanted everything spacious and more luxurious, and it was going to be their top quality boat. And it was, and it ran for a little while, but they soon realized that they had to basically sell it out at 155 passengers to even turn a profit. So that turned out that maybe that was not really a great idea. And of course, they built the Countess, which sat for 2 years and really didn't carry anybody. So the end result was you took 400 passengers on the American Queen and you spread them out on three boats. You know, as soon as those boats started running, well, the counts on the American Queen sunk. So now you got three boats carrying 400 people instead of one boat making a profit. And it just went down and down and down and down from there. I mean, it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it happened, and that's basically how ACL came in. They bought it as a fire sale, as a bankruptcy fire sale to clear all the debt from a bankruptcy encountered by Hornblower. Hornblower was not the first company. The first guy who bought the American Queen out was John Wagner, but he had actually gotten out of the company, you know, before this all had hit. He was an executive board member or something like that. It was a fancy title. he did all the speaking, public speaking, and the events, but he really wasn't financially involved at the time that it tanked.
Tell me whatever you can about the history of the American Queen. Tell me about the vessel itself, how she was built, any details you care to share to commemorate her.
American Queen was built in 1995. She was built back in Amelia in the Bayou at Bollinger Shipyard. It's called Bollinger right now. I think it was Quality Shipyard at the time. It was at Sugar House Bend, mile 86 on the ICWS. And I was on the Mississippi Queen sort of when she came out. I really didn't step on board the American Queen till probably around 99 or 2000. And that of course is because there was a pilot on there that I had worked with. And he said, "Come on over and see the boat." We're tied side by side in Natchez, actually. So that was the first time I had been on. I was like, wow, this is really cool. I don't think that they could have designed or built anything that was more a tribute to steamboats than the American Queen. I mean, she had the best of the best. She had a little bit of Delta Queen. She had whatever it took from the modern era of the Mississippi Queen. She had dining rooms that were built to resemble a J.M. White, which was an old steamboat. And it was probably the most pleasurable of all vessels to work on. I mean, I eventually started on the American Queen as a pilot. I watched the captain turn over thing, and I wasn't too excited about that. I knew politics and I knew where that was going, and I by all means didn't want to be a captain. But towards the end, which was about the last 6 years, I was, and I hate to say it's because there wasn't really anybody else licensed to do it, but that's kind of like it was. One of the things that always turned me off about being a captain on those three boats, the American Queen, Mississippi Queen, and Delta Queen, is that the captain really didn't do the piloting. You had a captain and you had two pilots. And the piloting thing is always what interests me, not necessarily the captain role. Lately, as things got worse financially for the company, they decided to run things like a towboat where the captain stood the first pilot watch and the pilot was the second pilot. That worked out really great for me. So when they changed it to that, then I was interested. I said, yeah, I'll do that. Plus, you got the first watch, so it was better.
Tell me about some experiences operating the American Queen. Professionally, maybe some stories about passengers getting unruly or something.
No, those boats have people that are afraid to say they just were too old to be unruly. Uh, if there was somebody unruly, it was somebody complaining about cold soup. Uh, the real interesting stuff was like on the President and the Admiral, when you had the real nightly fights. One of the things that Strexus did was, and I never did quite understand it, it would be a shocker for today's management systems and passenger boats, but they allowed everybody to bring their own booze. So all those rock concerts and everything else was a BYOB event. And of course, if you left the boat carrying a bottle that still had alcohol in it, you were everything less than a man. I mean, you had to drink all your stuff while you were there. So the fights and the interesting stuff back then, that was really something. In fact, all those passenger boats actually had jails that were located on the main deck. I have plenty of pictures of that. We always used to take our own pictures inside the jail, as a smart ass, just to say, hey, look at this. But yeah, it got pretty rowdy at times. But for the most part, everything was under control. And as things matured, by way of the president that was running the night cruises, we had a lot of real popular bands. I mean, we had the Rolling Stones, Clarence Frogman Henry, Joan Jett, Foreigner. I mean, I just about met every band possible on there, which music is a big interest to me. So that was really a good deal. On the American Queen side, a lot of people don't realize this, but most of the time, you might be able to make about 70 or 80 miles, and you'll always have a medical emergency. I mean, like it or not, I mean, the people that rode just weren't really in exactly the best kind of shapes. I mean, it was all kind. I think I landed that boat at every boat ramp possible to discharge somebody into an ambulance. And that was a real thing. You always had to make sure that when you got to your destinations, you wanted to do it in a timely manner. You didn't want to slow down and wait. And of course, what are you going to do when you're northbound? You have to wait on the towboats. A lot of the highly experienced pilots would let you come up and they would be able to meet you and it would be no problem. Other guys would just insist that, no way, you need to stay down there and wait. So when you had these hour, 2 hour delays and you weren't getting to your destination, not only were you late for your shore stops and your excursions, but you were taking a chance with the people that you had with medicals. And that was the whole thing. Medicals pretty much ran everything there.
Well, Cap, tell me about that last voyage on the American Queen and kind of maybe any feelings of nostalgia, anything you're
Oh,
gonna really miss.
absolutely. When that's not the first boat that I've been on when it was laid up. I recall that I made a trip on the President, and she had a boiler problem, and it was going to be our conversion to diesel. Um, and it was a sort of a somber moment because you were losing the last side wheel steamboat. So it kind of felt like that. It kind of felt like you're driving a pet to the vet to be put down, in a way. Um, it One thing that was totally amazing for a boat that really didn't have a lot of good mechanical history at times, it kind of came through and just everything went right perfect on that road. There was no breakdowns, there was no nothing, you know, no glitches. It's kind of like the boat was going to show that she was still good. It was kind of creepy. Um, I'm not really a fan of what we have to do. I want to say I did probably at least 15 or 20 trips to where you have to go down and go out Southwest Pass and go into the Gulf with those flat bottom river boats because they don't fit through the Algiers Lock or Harvey Lock. They're too wide. So when you go into Homo, you go into Morgan City, you go into Amelia, or even if you go into the storage fleet where we got her, in Beaumont, that's all outside. You have to take the passes and run outside in the Gulf and then come back in. Uh, that was an unusually calm trip. The last one, I mean, she didn't rock and roll too much, hardly at all. We had really good weather, made good speed. Um, the Going into the scrapyard was pretty incredible because it was a real small area, small slip, but everything went well, man. We went sailed right through it and up to the dock, and that was a wrap. You always hate to do those kind of things, but as you work more and more often, it just feels like I'm working right now at Magnolia Marine. You're doing it. It's a job, it's a paycheck, and that's the first foremost. The nostalgia and what's sad about it that always comes later. You kind of put that behind you.
Well, public opinion on trusty old Facebook has been pretty polarized on this queen. Do we know for sure her destiny? Is she in fact getting cut up?
No, there's no decision that's been made yet. Um, she's there at the yard. Uh, and I'm still very close to a lot of the ACL people. I mean, I really wouldn't have any problem at all going to work there. In fact, to keep up the passenger boats as well as the towboats, I'd still always like to do the same till I retire. But I've been able to find out straightforward that right now what she's actually in storage. I think what they're waiting a decision. I very, very seriously doubt that she'll ever run again under that company would not run her. Their things, and you really have to look at the two, just like I compared earlier in this interview, New Orleans Steamboat Company to a Streckfus line or something like that. You have to look at what ACL is. ACL is 100-ton boats. They're designed specifically to fit under those conditions, which means they have all 100-ton captains. There are a few people that have more licenses, of course, and that's what they like to see. But the reality is, it's a really well-run economic plan. I mean, they don't spend a lot of money. There's very little entertainment. Uh, the the passengers go on for a boat ride. Unlike the American Queen Company, American Queen Voyages, they have a vast itinerary all around the United States. Not only do they have the West Coast, but they have the cruises that are going in New York up the Hudson River. They have cruises on the Potomac to go to D.C., but it's all based on exactly what's written on their brochures, buses, and everything. It's small passenger boating, uh, and I can see uh, the first thing everybody's going to say, you don't want to knock ACL. But I really don't. It's just not that boat. The American Queen is just could not possibly fit into their program, that criteria. Uh, if you read their literature, what they say what we're not, well, what they're not is exactly what the American Queen is or was. Inside staterooms, they all want outside fancier rooms. They want new, they don't want old. They don't really care for nostalgia. That's just not it's not their motif of operation, man. It'd be like you and I playing rock and roll and trying to sit in a outfit that plays classical music. It's just two different genres. I mean, it's not going to fit. So to think that the American Queen would ever operate again, that'd be a real bold step on their behalf to crank her up. I mean, it would kind of go against the grain of what made them successful. And I just don't see it. I don't see it going to another company. That's why they bought it, to keep it from another company to operate it. That's three vessels that got taken out of their hair. So that's just the way it is.
Do you see her fate potentially maybe as a museum ship towed up somewhere and tied off?
Possibly. But then again, my rebuttal for that would be look at the Delta Queen right now. You know, there was all the gung ho thing on the exemption, and ACL spent a lot of money on fighting the exemption because they didn't want her to come out. But I'm very, very, very close to the Delta Queen owners, and um, unless somebody just comes in with a pot of money and takes on that project, um, it's probably not going to happen. This is where people are wrong. It can be done. There are certain things and drawings that look pretty good as far as repairing and replacing the boilers. I think actually, if that boat actually would crank up, it probably would do quite well. I mean, I think it would have hard ridership for 5 to 6 years. The 3 years is your write off for the government. Um, I think that all the owners, the owners that I know, are all pretty positive. If somebody came into the plan and put the money down, it could be gone. Um, Same thing could happen to the American Queen. You could have somebody that would decide to put it in and make it a hotel. I travel a lot. My wife and I are just always traveling from town to town, and particularly with all the music festivals and things like Mardi Gras and all. You would think that when you go to a place and there's something going on with a limited amount of hotels, the hotels were always sold out, the casino rooms were always sold out. You would think the American Queen, even like in New Orleans, would have a place where it could sit there and be a hotel. Just a thought. I mean, that's a capacity of 436 people. I mean, that's pretty significant.
Well, Captain Bert, I thank you again for joining me here today. Any final thoughts, maybe what this industry has meant to you in your life?
I would do it again. I don't have any children, but I can tell you, if I had a son or a daughter, I would encourage them to do towboating. I think that's where it's always been, where it's always at. I think you can pretty much have something that you can work on that's a regular thing. I think the passenger boats, I mean, you got to have a real strong system to hang with that, because you stop and think about it, they're strictly relying on people to buy tickets to ride these things. It's not like they're pushing a product and making so much money for doing that and delivering a product. So I think that the towboats, as far as sustainability, is definitely where it's at in the future. Um, I think that things are getting a whole lot better in the industry total. I think that things are really coming around to where it was like back when I started. Um, I think it's certainly open to a whole lot more people than it was when I started. I was like the outsider guy, and that's not only for the Pilots Association. That was for the passenger boats, the everything. I mean, I think now I think if somebody uh, puts their mind to it as coming up from deck to do it, I mean, it can be done. I think the sad thing is that there's not really too many people that are taking that route.
Thanks again, my friend. We'll keep in touch.
Hey, thank you.
This has been a production of Where You At Studios, LLC.